Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the second panel of this afternoon's event. And thank you again to our contributors for the first half. I'd just like to apologise for some of the sound issues we've experienced. We've got some slight issues with mics and connections for some of our individual speakers. We're hoping this is going to be okay for the second panel. Just to remind you that the event recording with closed caption subtitles will be available to view from next week on the OFS's YouTube channel. And for everyone who's consented to allow us to follow up with you by email, we'll send those links out. Also, just another reminder, if you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, and it's just so brilliant how many of you are doing this already, please go through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. We're just trying to reserve the chat function for any kind of technical or practical Zoom concerns. So we're now going to move forward to our second panel, which will focus on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on teaching and learning. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this afternoon by Sarah Al-Kawad, Welfare and Equality Officer at Newcastle University Students' Union, Alison Shaw, Professor of Practice for Student Success and Progression at Newcastle University, and Gautam Singh, Associate Professor in Equity of Attainment at Coventry University. And we're going to start with Sarah this afternoon. I'm just going to give a brief bio and then I'll hand over to you, Sarah. As Newcastle University's Student Union Welfare and Equality Officer, Sarah's priorities have been to ensure diverse and efficient mental health facilities and pastoral support are in place for students to access. She has focused on bettering integration and inclusion of all students, and as well as representation of marginalised backgrounds and cultures. She's organised campaigns and events to raise awareness of key issues, including mental health, sexual assault, Black History Month, LGBT+ Week, disability awareness, student affordability and housing. So I'm sure she's going to have a lot of really brilliant things to say to us about in the field of learning and teaching. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Good. Okay. I'm hoping the mic's not going to switch off, but thanks for that introduction. Very kind words. Yeah, so I guess I'm the student rep here, and I guess people were asking for more of a student voice, which is great. So I can kind of provide that lived experience and talk about how to support BAME students, but also offer some solutions from what I see as supporting people through COVID and post-COVID if we get to that point. So I guess overall my main concern is the lack of inclusive and safe spaces for BAME students because of COVID. And I guess one of the main points I'm going to go through the problems first and then the solutions. But, you know, the fact that student societies are not going to be as visible because of, you know, the danger of doing physical events like Freshers' Fair, meet and greet events, and not being able to promote themselves as easily in a physical space. And so therefore, you know, incoming BAME students are not going to be able to access these societies as easily. And, you know, societies are very much fundamental to BAME students' social experience and therefore their learning experience and making sure their mental health is okay. Also, even with these societies, how do they efficiently translate those activities that they usually do online? That's a big question. You know, a lot of these societies, you know, religious or cultural societies do a lot of food events, cultural events, religious events that are really dependent on the physical. And it's going to be hard for them to maintain engagement and successfully translate these online. There's also a risk, obviously, of a smaller intake of BAME students as a result of COVID and the financial implications of COVID, particularly because of our international community. But what that means for BAME students that do attend our universities this year is that there's going to be less visible people on campus that look like them, that resemble the same or similar lived experience to them. So how does that feel? You know, you don't, as a BAME student, you can't access those societies because you're not aware of them. And then you can't even see people on campus that look like you. You know, you're going to automatically feel a sense of isolation. That brings me on to my third point, which is, you know, many universities like Newcastle, in my experience, you know, are situated in white cities and therefore, you know, struggle because of being white institutions as well to engage BAME students. And I think many BAME students are dependent on the localized community in developing a sense of belonging and community in the city. So in Newcastle, for example, Fenham is, you know, a really amazing space. It's got food shops, Afro hair shops, it's got clubs and music scenes that students love. and it's got mosques and churches and Hindu and Sikh temples, and those are really fundamental spaces for BAME students to establish themselves and establish a sense of belonging. And without that, because of the restrictions and lockdown measures in place, how do we ensure that BAME students are really feeling represented and safe? And I think that means that it's up to us as a university to start taking initiatives forward, and ensuring that our classrooms, because they're going to be key spaces for students that they're going to be engaged in, and our halls as well, because people would be in halls most of their time in lockdown or in quarantine, are safe and inclusive spaces. Obviously, there's also a risk of online racism and online trauma. We've seen it in the Black Lives Matter movement. There's an amazing amount of activism taking place, but on the backhand of that, there's also a lot of racism and also a lot of graphic, distressing images and videos being circulated online. So how do we ensure that we are well aware of cyberbullying and racism measures, and that there is accurate and safe reporting measures in place for students who want to flag those up? So I'm going to quickly whiz through the solutions. But I guess we need for societies greater support for key students groups, so that they provide a sense of belonging for our BAME students. So, not just using the marketing from the Students' Union perspective, but also can the university be using their comms in enabling, promotion for those societies as well. We need to make our digital learning spaces more inclusive. This is a time when we can really build on initiatives like the decolonising curriculum, access and participation plan objectives. We've all mentioned these before. Speaking more openly about race and racism in a safe manner, in order for students to feel like they're part of that online learning community, but also providing feedback loops for students to raise issues with the classroom conduct, not just in terms of students, but also the conduct of professors or how they engage with BAME students. So, using Blackboard or Canvas or whatever to make sure that those anonymous feedback loops are felt and are heard, but also using student reps like EDI reps. That's something that's been rolled out at Newcastle University this year, ensuring that, students are hearing and acting as a mouthpiece when BAME students don't feel comfortable raising some of those issues. Also, calling out racial harassment from early on. We need to be doing more online inductions. We can be working with charities and local organisations in delivering those inductions, but also, looking into our report and support mechanisms and ensuring that they're up to date and allow, online racism and online harassment to report that, and also, recognising that microaggressions and subtler forms of racism are a part of racism. How to report that as well through our channels is really important. But yeah, I better finish now because I think I got my 1 minute mark about 2 minutes ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I loved your solutions-focused approach there. I'm sure we'll get some really good questions for you on some of that. Look forward to exploring it further. So we'll come back to you, obviously, in the Q&A session. So our next speaker is Alison Shaw. Allison is a Professor of Practice and Student Success and Progression at Newcastle University. And prior to her current role, she worked as Visiting Professor of Innovation and Enterprise within the Business School at Newcastle University. She's also founded the Northeast Futures UTC, providing relevant and challenging educational and cultural opportunity for the region's young people. Allison is an experienced secondary head teacher with over 30 years in the state education system, 20 of which were in senior leadership posts in schools in North Tyneside. She has a track record of curriculum innovation and collaborative effort to bring education and employers together to benefit both young people and the wider economy. Please, I'm going to pass over to you now, Alison.
Amy, thank you. And I'm sure everyone will understand the benefit that I've had in my short time in this post of working with Sarah. And I'd just like to acknowledge that because she's helped me hugely in the learning that I've needed to do and need to continue to do. So I'm just simply now going to offer some reflections on some of the conditions for successful learning to take place, and do this just through the COVID-19 lens. I don't think that these conditions for learning are actually any different in the current crisis, but achieving them is much harder, largely because the inequalities are amplified, and the levels of impact of the current crisis on certain groups, as we know so well, are very different, particularly for Black and minority ethnic groups, and those from groups where there are intersections of characteristics which make them more vulnerable to harrowing or difficult experiences. So in terms of these conditions for successful learning, I think I can suggest that we thrive as learners when we have high challenge but low stress, and That means we need a sense of belonging, including being able to see people like ourselves in positions which connote success, and when we're able to feel that we're fully included in learning conversations. I think in terms of the curriculum, we need to be able to confidently and on equal terms with other learners have full access to both the modes of knowledge that are being taught, but also the expected modes of discourse that are used to explore that knowledge. And for some students, especially including those from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, the implicit assumptions of the still largely Eurocentric faculty need to be demystified and actually often challenged or opened up for debate in themselves. Thirdly, I want to talk about the awarding gap. The acknowledgement is growing in higher education that we're dealing with an awarding gap, and that requires us to reflect on its causes and not to accept them as unexplained. So we have to help the academy reflect not only on unconscious bias, but on the privileges enjoyed by people like me. And actually on what I'd call affinity, so that learners can feel what affinity means and feel it consistently, all of them. My next point is about communication, because the difficulty clearly of communicating with and actively supporting students has been set into relief during this crisis all too seriously. So we know and feel that students really need to be listened to, particularly at times like this, when they're suffering all sorts of barriers and difficulties, from personal experience through to simply the practicalities of being able to learn. Even in more normal circumstances, but particularly now, finding models for sustained consultation, as Sarah mentioned, that feedback and discussion with students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds is absolutely essential. My fifth point is about personalisation for learning, and students certainly from schools in this country understand exactly what personalisation means. And it's obviously essential for students from international backgrounds as well. So important for successful transition to university life or back to university life under these new conditions. It's essential that we find ways to help students feel that this personalised experience is part of what they can expect from their university. By way of conclusion, I'd just like to say that Amy, as you uncomfortably mentioned, it's a long time since I started my teaching career. And I began my teacher training just as the Swan Report was published. That's back in 1985. And even then it spoke to preconceptions and privilege. And since then, of course, multiple times we've had reports of this kind which have referenced institutional racism. We cannot not now move at greater pace. So if anything, the demands of this current COVID-19 crisis give me some hope, as well, may I say, as the impact of George Floyd's murder, that change will come faster at last. We absolutely have to make that be so as a result of what's happening at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I think that's a really great call to action, actually, for us to reflect on as we move forward through the discussion portion of this as well. So our final speaker before we move into the Q&A section is Gautam Singh, who has recently published a briefing note on supporting BAME students, which has been shared extensively amongst the higher education community. And we'll be circulating this as well as other materials that we've discussed today after the event. So Dr. Singh is currently a Professor of Equity and Attainment and Principal Lecturer in Social Work at Coventry University. He is a visiting fellow in race and education at the University of the Arts at Coventry University and visiting professor of social work at the University of Chester. Prior to entering academia in 1993, he worked as a professional social worker and community activist. In addition to his academic work, Gautam has developed a media profile and over the past 6 years has regularly presented discussions and debates on minority TV channels, including the Sikh channel and the Akal channel, as well as BBC radio networks. So we're hoping, Gautam, that you all your sound and vision will be in tip-top condition then. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Amy, and thanks to everybody who's made today possible. I think all the contributions have been absolutely fantastic. You know, there's a saying that one should strike when the iron's hot. Well, in the kind of present moment, in the context of COVID and also the public execution of George Floyd, the iron is not hot but molten at the moment, yeah? And though for BAME people, staff and students, precariety is a norm, I think we live in times where we're all experiencing a sense of fear, uncertainty, and perhaps, if not physical death, for some it is physical death, then certainly an existential crisis demanding us to ask fundamental questions about such matters as what is the meaning of society, what is the meaning and purpose of education, and in fact, what is a university itself? And I was reminded of the political philosopher Hannah Arendt in her famous essay following the ruins of the Second World War and the Nazi Holocaust, which was entitled The Crisis of Education, that she pointed out that learning did not equal education. For her, learning can be quite a personal experience, whereas education takes us beyond ourselves. As she says, education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it. So I think that's the kind of challenge that we're facing. It's not about responsibility for ourselves, it's about the responsibility for the world around us. And in this present moment of crisis, we are seeing massive state intervention, a resurgence of the values of collectivism, if you like, and a collapse of commodity capitalism. You know, we left asking how relevant is a neoliberal model of education that we are all, willingly or otherwise, compelled to deliver. And COVID-19 has shone light on the ongoing crisis of racism and racial violence, reflected in BAME COVID deaths, but also in the public execution of George Floyd, which has left us all asking, searching questions about our sense of being, belonging, and doing. You know, what do we do in this world? And for Black people and people of colour, this is not new. We have to confront these existential questions all the time. But for those colleagues who are situated within white subjectivity, what Audre Lorde calls the mythical norm, unless you are from the kind of Katie Holmes or Donald Trump persuasion, or is it Hopkins, I'm not sure, then the kinds of questions in your minds will be, what can I do to tackle racism? Is it sufficient for me to distance myself from racism? In other words, to be non-racist, is that a passive position? Or do I need to become anti-racist, active? And what does that mean anyway, to become anti-racist? And I came across something just yesterday from Nicola Rollock in the Financial Times. It was a piece called, "It's Time for White People to Step Up for Black Colleagues." And she throws down the gauntlet for white people who want to become allies in anti-racist change. And she says, I quote, "White allyship means divesting from the very histories, structures, systems, assumptions, and behaviors that keep white people in positions of power. And generally power is to be maintained, not relinquished." So really one of the central questions for us all, I think, is this sense of belonging, and particularly for BAME students. There's overwhelming evidence that students who experience a true sense of belonging are more engaged in their learning course of study, and this leads to better outcomes. We know that. So the question we need to ask is, how is the COVID-19 crisis impacting BAME students' sense of belonging in institutions that were already felt to be hostile? In the short term, it's difficult to know precisely how the lockdown will impact students, but there is some evidence from schools. There was a rapid evidence assessment impact on schools done by the Educational Endowment Foundation, and they suggested some quite worrying trends. They found that school closures are likely to reverse progress made to narrow attainment gaps. In fact, they suggest that the gap might widen up to 36%, the median. So it's clear for me, particularly for disadvantaged students, physically being at university is critical to enable a sense of belonging to a community of learning. I think by shifting big lectures online and by developing flipped classrooms, we can really focus on building belonging and learning on small group tutorial learning. And in the sense, we're taking a lead from Indigenous pedagogy here and from this notion of learning circles. I think we need to go back to learning circles and all that kind of big classroom stuff. Throw that online if you want. I think advantaged students are likely to access and develop all kinds of proxies in this kind of crisis of homeschooling, friends network, study groups, etc. Especially if they're on campus, I think we'll find a lot more of that going on. So again, if we're not careful, if we don't, as it were, create equal opportunities for these kinds of spaces to evolve, then we may well have two classes of students. Online learning is a new norm, but poor online teaching is likely to widen the gap for the same reasons that being advantaged give you more options, and you can compensate for poor teachers if you're advantaged. If you're disadvantaged, you haven't maybe got that infrastructure around you. So ensuring elements of effective teaching are present for example, through clear explanation, scaffolding and feedback, is more important now than ever was the case, I think. So we need to develop what Bell Hooks terms a pedagogy of liberation. So the current moment of crisis provides a historic opportunity to shift the old ancient paradigm of higher education, which is rooted, as I say, in hierarchical, white, Western-centric views of human knowledge, an ability which to varying degrees we've all internalized. Let's be honest. We all want to get into Oxbridge. We all want to go to Russell Group universities. Why? Because we've internalized this notion of elitism. We need to move towards a much more collaborative model from the Descartesian individualistic mode of thinking, from I think so therefore I am, to a collective way of thinking rooted in indigenous traditions of we think so therefore we are. And that has massive implications as to where we assess students. Why should we have, why should individual assessment predominate when we have to create a world in which we have to work together to find collective solutions? The COVID crisis reminds us that the most important things in life probably are quality of relationships, caring for each other. This is also to addressing issues related to a sense of belonging as well, because you can't really have belonging if you don't care for each other. And critically, this means we need to focus on the meanings of education, not just the mechanisms of delivery. So the idea that faculty can simply move their courses online is hugely problematic. It's rooted in the assumption that education is simply transmission of information, which it's not. Education is about making ourselves, it's about becoming human, if you like, and you require collective, immersive, and embodied experience for these kinds of things to happen, deliberative, collaborative. So these pedagogies are not optional extras, but the products of decades of research and experience, as well as important commitments to equality and reconciliation that are not meant to be upheld only when convenient. So privileged students will be able to develop those proxies, I think. And so we really need not to take anything for granted. So out of the new normal post-COVID-19 university must be built upon social and humanizing components of education. We must not assume that BAME students will have the means to engage in online learning in an equitable way, and we must assume responsibility for ensuring all students are unable to do so. So whilst identifying disadvantages, we must work harder at avoiding deficit explanations for BAME attainment. And I think that we can learn a lot here from the work on health inequalities, learning from the big body of knowledge on social determinants of health by balancing personalized learning strategies, which are kind of downstream solutions, with upstream structural solutions. So we really need to really think hard about how do structural factors impact attainment and outcomes, and how can we then do something about that?
Thank you so much, Gautam. That was a really powerful input there for us, and a huge amount that we can explore in more depth, I think, now through the questions. So if you can all unmute, just so that you're ready to I'm ready to throw to you in terms of questioning. I wondered if we could start with how can we use the current crisis, and particularly the rapid work that colleagues across the sector have put into in terms of transforming delivery, to rethink pedagogy and develop more inclusive ways of learning. Is there anyone who'd like to have a run at that first? Alison, please.
Well, I think that actually, I agree very much with what Gautam was saying about moving things online. And if you just try and move online what we used to do, then it's going to be very problematical. But actually, and people do need time to do this. We've got to acknowledge that it does take time to rethink pedagogy and rethink the way that you're delivering your curricula. But actually, I feel quite optimistic about the consideration that goes into planning learning when it has to move online. It really does require thought in terms of sequencing and the interaction that is required with the content. So I think that given the time and some serious training and dialogue with those who are delivering learning and teaching, there's some optimism here. We can perhaps talk about assessment later, but I'm thoroughly delighted with the disruption that's taking place in modes of assessment, because it needed to happen, and this is kind of required that to happen. And as I think it was Sarah who said earlier, I may be wrong, it may have been Gary, but the idea that it was particularly Gary who was talking about choice in assessment. This is very important for inclusive modes of assessment. And so we need to hold on to some of the things that have changed and develop them proactively, so that we retain some of the learning that we've had in this time.
Thanks, Alison. Gautam, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, just very briefly, I was on another forum the other day, and one of the questions that arose was doing online examinations. And you probably know that Cambridge University also now abandoned their old kind of archaic methods and actually going to go online for examinations. But they were raising concerns about students colluding. So the question was, how can we stop students colluding? I said, well, why should we stop students colluding? Isn't colluding another way of thinking about working together? And isn't that how are we solving the problems of COVID? By colluding with each other. And so it seems to me that there's a disjuncture between what we're trying to do in higher education through assessment methods and teaching and learning and the reality of our lived experiences out there. So I think we need to begin to work much more on collaborative ways of learning, and we need to be develop more sophisticated ways of using assessment as a way for encouraging students to teach each other, to help each other to learn, not as it were to compete with each other to get on top of the kind of tree. So, you know, I think it's a radical reimagination of assessment. And who owns knowledge? Who owns their kind of intellectual production? You know, as academics, we publish together and claim the whole thing for ourselves on our CVs, yet somehow for students, it has to be in isolation. Why?
Sarah, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I guess one of my concerns would also be in the classroom how BAME students are going to feel exposed, because I think, especially in seminar context, you know, there is sometimes a bit of a point your finger, like, oh, I haven't heard from you, so, you know, can you speak up? And I think that's going to be specifically difficult in this kind of context and being online and feeling like you have to unmute your mic and make this kind of grand statement about how you feel about a certain type of text. And I think that does also happen when we speak about sort of, especially because I did English literature, but, you know, when we speak about sort of Black narratives or slave narratives, or we discuss things to do with BAME students, we tend to target BAME students to ask some questions, maybe subconsciously or whatever, but being cautious about how you feel and how exposed you feel being on a microphone, being on a screen, and how that kind of mirrors quite a lot of anxieties for BAME students, and not putting them on the spot unnecessarily. You know, even just using the chat icon and being like, you know, does anyone want to speak up? If you don't want to speak up, just let me know on the chat or whatever, and making sure that, you know, that space remains safe for BAME students is really important.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to a more practical question that we've had in around some of the real barriers that particularly BAME students can experience in accessing online learning, and how we can work towards more equitable engagement in online learning and teaching. I might just direct this one towards Gautam for now, because I know you particularly picked up this point in your paper.
Yeah, I think this question of digital divide is a really big one. I think my worry is that some universities are assuming that because everybody's got a mobile phone, that somehow everybody's, you know, kind of connected. So I think it's an issue of hardware, it's an issue of software, it's an issue of broadband access as well, and the kind of speeds. It's also an issue of private study spaces. And BAME students, we know, are more likely to be living at home, and we know that they're more likely to be experiencing overcrowding. I was just looking at some data. The ONS did some research on English housing, and this was data from 2014 to 17. And this is that Bangladeshi families are 15 times more likely to be overcrowded than white families, Pakistani 8 times, and Black families 6 times. Now, this roughly correlates with the attainment gaps. So here you can see these patterns, you know, in terms of spaces. So I think we need to also rethink what is a campus. You know, we're already thinking about the virtual campus, but we need to even rethink the physical campus, because it seems to me that if we're going to have social distancing, that in itself is you know, mean that we've got to repurpose campuses. But if there's going to be more online learning, then what about having clusters of, you know, having spaces where people are? You know, maybe we need to take university campuses back into communities. There was a time when they were positioned in communities. Why don't we create community hubs? And now universities could collaborate. You know, you don't need to have one hub for Birmingham University next to a Coventry one, next to a Warwick one. Why don't you have collective hubs? And I think that's the kind of stuff that OFS should be encouraging, is to create these collective hubs. I mean, public libraries in a sense were collective hubs, but they've been disappearing rapidly. So I think we need to redistribute the campus, if you like, back into communities.
Alison.
Yeah, I think that just in terms of what I was meaning by personalisation, not making assumptions about groups of students and what they may or may not have, but actually ensuring that we have means of communicating at a personal level with students and at a small group level with students, and actually ensuring that both Black and minority ethnic students, but also socially and economically deprived students can tell us, you know, that we ask them proactively, sensitively, if they have the tools for learning or not, and if they don't, that we ensure that we make sure that we provide them with them, wherever they are actually.
Thanks, Alison. Building on that and just thinking about, you know, operating more commonly in an online space or you know, in a more mainstream way, how can we ensure that those online spaces are safe and they are free from that harassment and microaggressions and just general racist behaviour that we might see or might be enabled by a move to more online interaction? Sarah, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few questions in the Q&A about this as well, is about kind of subtle forms of racism and how we can call them out in a way that really, I guess, doesn't start fostering this sort of white guilt or white fragility of students feeling like, oh, I didn't mean to say that in a negative way, I didn't think that meant to be a compliment, because a lot of the time that microaggressions and some form of racism isn't necessarily a negative or purposefully intended to harm people. It's framed as a positive, but you know, it is still racist. So I think it's really dependent on the way we do inductions, and I guess like trying to come up with some sort of, because I had an idea earlier this year before COVID, and creating these sort of pamphlets which students BAME students created about microaggressions and casual forms of racism, and it would kind of go in freshers' bags and people can read about it. But obviously that's not possible this year, but you know, you can still do that in an online sphere and do PDF copies of that. And you know, the best way you can do that is asking students to come forward and inform that work and pay students to do that work. And you know, the use of videos as well. I did a project last year where I got students to pick out microaggressions from a hat and discuss how that was for them, and it was quite funny, and it was, you know, lighthearted, but it talked about some really serious things. So we know we need to be using technology in a way of like communicating what racism is and changing the culture in a way that students don't feel like they're being attacked, because what happens when white students particularly or non-black students feel like they are attacked, you know, they feel like they don't want to engage in that resource, they don't want to engage in the kind of cultural change. So being able to kind of disseminate that information in a safe way for BAME students, but also for white students, is really important.
Yeah, I suppose one way is to recognise the reality of microaggressions, yeah? And because they're kind of micro, we might not be able to register them, and you can only register it if you experience it. And even if you experience it, sometimes you can't register it because it's become such a kind of a norm for your experience, or you don't do anything about it. So I think that, you know, staff have got to just work on the basis that we're surrounded by these things. And then we've got to work hard at what we call microaffirmations. I think that's really important. My sense is that what happens with white colleagues, with white students, is they automatically engage in microaffirmations, yeah? And with black students, it's the opposite way. And it's the same thing in kind of racial profiling and how police and how other people respond to black and white people differently. Just for example, just in the COVID crisis, I don't know if you know, but you know, if you're BAME, you're much more likely to be stopped by the police and actually charged for breaking lockdown rules. But if you're Dominic Cummings, of course, you know, the whole country knows that you broke down the rule, but you're still not charged. I don't know if that's a microaggression, but if it is, it's a good one against him. But this is the important thing, because there's a whole discussion now from the kind of the murder of George Floyd around white people kneeling down, around white people saying, we need now to take responsibility. Well, better late than never, I guess. But you don't solve microaggressions by deploying aggressions. So I think the way we deal with that is that just like these categories, BAME, are not really about the student. You know, we're just human beings, aren't we, really? We get positioned in those categories. And it's the assumption about the category that often leads to the aggression. So, you know, there's no such thing as a white person either. White people get positioned in whiteness. So I think the way in which we begin to address these microaggressions is not to personalize, don't conflate the the discursive construct that positions us with the human being. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to humanize each other. So I think we need to develop, white people need to not become defensive and need to understand how people might challenge them but then engage in dialogue that, you know, I mean, I'm masculinity is a huge problem for me. It's a huge problem for society. But I've got to own that masculinity, and I've got to then struggle with it, yeah? And so whiteness shouldn't be something that's seen as, oh, you know, you can't call me white, I'm not racist. It's not about that. It's about taking ownership of the kind of culture and discourse in which we're all born and how we change that.
Alison.
I think if I can just follow up on that, in a practical way, some of the work that we're trying to make sure happens as we move into this next term is to change some of the training and preparation that we give to our tutors, our personal tutors and our peer mentors, to include quite explicitly elements of racism and how you support groups of students who might be experiencing microaggressions, amongst other things, other harassments online in different ways. So there's a kind of training element, and whilst I think, you know, some of the training that takes place, it's easy if people feel attacked, like you said, for them to kind of zone out on that. But, you know, this needs to be led from the top of the university, and in many universities now, because of the situation that we're finding, it is more explicitly being led from the top, and to capitalize on that now and open the dialogue so that the acknowledgement by people like me of the privilege that I didn't ask for, but I have and can, you know, I'm lucky enough to be able to choose how to disperse that privilege that I've had. And so leading by example and opening up the discussions enlists more people into this work. And it is hard, emotional, intellectual work of learning about what we're talking about, and then making sure that the mechanisms practically are there in the university to do something about it. I remain, as you know, because I've said for 30 years, seeing this glacial pace of change, little change. Now there is some hope because of this kind of coincidence of events that we might seize the day.
Thanks, Alison. I wondered if I could move on and perhaps just probe a little bit more about kind of activism with Sarah around what does that look like in this kind of online space, and how can we ensure that all the great work that students' unions do to activise, to do activities and projects around decolonising the curriculum, student societies, working with groups, how can we maintain that? How can you as students' unions kind of maintain that visibility during this kind of, you know, when you're kind of having work more on, engage more online?
Yeah, sure. I guess, I mean, we're lucky because all of us are quite versed as students with social media. I mean, I do feel out of touch, even though, like, I feel I'm still young, but, you know, that's how times change quickly with TikTok and all of that. But yeah, I think just it's difficult because right now, a lot of people who didn't usually take to social media, a lot of white people are kind of using it as activism and trying to learn about privilege and, you know, encouraging others to read books, especially like Renier Lodge's books and, you know, famous books about white fragility and what intersectionality is, etc. But I think it's very difficult actually for people of colour to see that sudden change in attitude. I mean, I've literally been on social media and been an activist basically, you know, for the last 4 or 5 years. But a lot of white people are suddenly coming to the front and being like, I want to change, you know, I want to share these images, I want to share this information, I want to get people to sign petitions. But, you know, there is some fear of it being a bit like aesthetic activism, and that it doesn't come from a genuine space, and also because people automatically think they're woke or they're kind of anti-racist if they share a picture of what whiteness means. And I think it's understanding that BAME students aren't automatically going to feel like appreciative of white people from coming forward online and being activists, because they're still angry about the years and years of tiring, exhausting work they've put into activism, and no one has cared, no one has listened, and suddenly everyone is speaking out about it. It's happened basically overnight, and that is not an easy thing to digest. Also, you know, the amount of times I've seen the death of George Floyd on social media is just ridiculous, and there's no trigger warnings, there's no warning signs, and I think people have forgotten you know, as a Black person, watching another Black person die on a screen is traumatic, it's emotional, and it's not necessarily a healthy way of spreading activism. So understanding that like some forms of activism isn't healthy, and it can be a scary space for Black people and people of colour to express themselves. So I guess like acknowledging that as people that, you know, especially staff members who aren't versed in, you know, social media, to kind of start learning about what it means to kind of share this information and how we can bring that into a classroom context and make sure people are aware of like how to kind of be an activist properly. And, you know, BAME students are still comfortable with using their social media in any way that they like. I guess in terms of like a student union perspective, you know, continue supporting the campaigns that they do, you know, you know, using comms, centralized comms to support those, you know, campaigns. I think a lot of campaigns can easily be translated online thanks to Zoom, thanks to these different technologies. And, you know, trying to join up in some of the campaigns is so important, because, you know, we need to stop doing campaigns challenging the university to change the curriculum, and the university just needs to change the curriculum. So, you know, it needs to be more of a joined up approach, and us kind of challenging society and higher ed on a national level rather than just ourselves, and actually creating tangible targets afterwards. You know, we need to come out with results, and we need to, when we set ourselves targets as an institution in a students' union, we need to actually report back to students on what those results are. You know, if we use students as listening exercises and they've given us valuable time and energy in, you know, telling us their lived experiences, then we need to tell them where that information has gone and what the results of that information is, and, you know, really show that we've appreciated their time and effort. So I think that's important. And yeah, just to continue doing the work we do, but actually now, you know, step it up a whole different level, and really make a difference, because this is the opportunity to.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really helpful. Gautam, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I just want to kind of maybe look at leaders in higher education and you know, in management teams, because I think what's happened over the years, there's been a big kind of divide between frontline staff and academics, teaching, and managers, and I think that's partly because managers have had to implement a kind of neoliberal model, and staff are still wedded to maybe other ways of doing things. And in fact, if you think about the George Floyd execution, one of the most heartening things that's come out of it is where senior police officers, where senior members of society, of government, have gone onto the front line, have become activists. And, you know, those images that we've seen of you know, frontline police officers, even soldiers kind of embracing the activists and kneeling down. Okay, that could be symbolic, that could be just a kind of sense of guilt, but I think what it says is that even if you're a leader of a you know, a vice chancellor, then you should speak out as well. And I think there's been a kind of a pattern now of vice chancellors and the senior university putting out statements about solidarity with George Floyd. Now, it has to go beyond a marketing ploy. I think at the moment it's still kind of marketing. I think it has to be genuine, and that means we have to start sacking lecturers. We have to start sacking lecturers who are racist. I mean, when was the last time a racist lecturer got disciplined? You know, we have to have the guts to do that. And so I think action's got to follow, not just the symbolism. Otherwise, it's easy. We can all share a tweet, or we can all send a picture out and things like that. So I think the proof of the pudding's in the eating. And I don't embarrass Ian, my colleague at Coventry, but one of the things I like about Ian is that his office is in where the students are. That's what, you know, he's always there. And, you know, and I think, you know, he's lived up to his word that for him, the students are the most important part of the university. So, yeah.
Thank you, Gautam. I wanted to move on to thinking about how we support our HE staff, our staff who are working providers, who are, you know, really doing that work directly with students. So I've got a couple of questions I'd like to explore with you. Alison, I might start with you on this one. How do we support colleagues to reflect on inequality and biases? And how do we ensure that the burden is not placed on BAME members of staff to undertake that work? I think that builds on some of the stuff that Sarah was talking about around white people wanting to educate themselves, but you know, it's not something it's not a switch that can be flicked overnight.
I very much agree. Yeah, so that sense of burdening what in most universities, particularly you know, elite universities, is a small proportion of staff, with the sense that they're responsible for telling the rest of us how to do it is not acceptable. We're working on our race equality charter work, which actually tells us that we need to do some structural, as well as cultural, but actually structural things to try and look at the staffing picture, and that's really important. And our Deputy Vice Chancellor has talked about moving at pace, so how we speed up our work. And I think, you know, in the short term, this work, the fact that it's remote is less important than actually the commitment to undertaking that work of opening up these conversations. And as I said earlier, it comes from formal spoken commitment at senior level. It comes from universities actually living the values that they espouse, and that means, as a number of people have said already, action to change the culture, action to make sure that there is visibility in the staff, but not necessarily making sure that absolutely making sure that those small number of staff don't carry the responsibility. But I think there's an interface here as well with the support that we can give students, so that making sure that in the teams who support students, not that Black and minority ethnic staff do all the work to support them, but that they're there as role models and colleagues who can help with the conversations. So living the values of the university and senior leadership to help colleagues open up the discussions, I think, are probably the most important things, but also the commitment that, as Sarah said earlier as well, we're talking about as learning institutions, seats of learning, that all of us are sharing these discussions, and that includes our white students as well as our white staff, so that the narrative and the dialogue are frank about the circumstance we're in. They're frank about white privilege, not as Gautam said, as an attack, but as actually a study of how we are where we are, and that we have to understand the evolution of our organisations in order, honestly, to be able to change the way they operate.
Thanks, Alison. Gautam, do you want to?
Just briefly, I mean, this is a really important issue, and I think that one of the key things is that we need to, for senior managers, we need to enable them to take difficult decisions, and we need, one of the things we need, this is it, yeah, one of the reasons why we don't have a diverse workforce at higher levels is because if you're a Black academic, or if you're a Black member of staff, then addressing these issues of racism and as a disadvantage are part of your being. It's not an option. So you have to do that. But in organizations, universities, they're still seen as kind of peripheral issues. They're seen as kind of side issues, you know, specialist interests. Now, if you actually switch on the TV or open a newspaper, you give me a story that doesn't have some connection to these issues. And why shouldn't there? It's about human beings and about survival. But somehow, when it comes to promoting people, then even if you have no commitment, no knowledge, no experience of these issues, somehow you're still a good candidate for promotion. Why should that be the case? You know, in fact, if you can't show commitment, you shouldn't be in a senior management position. You shouldn't be a head of a department if you cannot show a demonstrable record on the questions about equity. So we need to mainstream equity, not because not because it's politically correct, but because equity is what makes us human, as opposed to seeing that. And then Black colleagues who then do that work would not see that as almost a deficit. For a lot of Black colleagues, doing equity work is a deficit for getting into higher up into the organisation. That's because it's seen as a marginal issue.
Thank you very much, Gautam. I want to take one more question, and I think that would be, so I've got a note here, so about the last question. So how can we embed equality, diversity and inclusion activities, for example, anti-harassment or anti-racism campaigns, into online induction for new or returning students? This is looking ahead a little bit for the return in September, October time. Would anyone like to take a first run at that?
I don't mind, but given that we are now at Newcastle designing our induction programme, and of course it is largely online, it has to be possible that it's delivered online for students who might not be able to be present, even if the majority are. And you know, it is an active decision to include these issues in our programme. It's as simple as that at the senior levels, where the decisions are made about both content and mode of delivery and interaction in these programmes, that these things are included. And as I said earlier, that the preparation of colleagues and student peers who are involved in supporting new students are inducted into these matters. And I suppose one of the positive developments that I'm seeing happening as a result of our understanding of the heightened impact of a number of things happening at the moment on students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds is that we're doing more equality impact assessing than perhaps we were. Now, that those processes can be bureaucratic, technocratic, and sit on a shelf, or they can be made to be really meaningful, and we can hold ourselves accountable with those processes. So I think that is one method of making sure that we, as I say, hold ourselves to account on the way we're designing these new programs.
Thanks, Alison.
Yeah.
I'll go to Sarah because she's got a hand up. Sarah, could you unmute? Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like the issue is, when we talk about inductions, is at the moment we don't fully recognise hate crime as, you know, because we don't have the sufficient reporting channels for hate crime. We've done it for sexual misconduct because of the UK and all the reports that we have and the guidance, but we haven't really developed the hate crime channels on our report and support systems. I think that is the first point of contact that we should be like really pushing forward with, because without that kind of recognition of how to report hate crime, I know that we have Stop Hate UK and stuff like that, but a centralised channel and how to report and monitor hate crime, students don't realise that it's an issue and therefore are not keen to learn about it. So you need to start really understanding the numbers on campus and like really making sure that students feel empowered in terms of reporting hate crime. And then we need to be looking at how we can train people in, you know, not just what hate crime is, what racism is, but also how to become hate crime champions, how to take that further and become representatives, especially if you're a society, because so many societies, sports clubs and societies need to be trained on how to look out for racist conduct within their society, and how to be champions of that and how to signpost students to support and report systems. And then, you know, on a higher level, getting hate crime liaison officers at some point, in the same way we have sexual violence liaison officers as well. So I think we need to look at like the more complex picture when we talk about inductions, because it needs to feed into a system of reporting and supporting mechanisms for students of underrepresented groups.
Thank you, Sarah. I know Gurnan wanted to come in there.
Yeah,
as well.
I mean, just off the back of that, I think we need to normalise the reporting of hate crimes. I think it's a huge emotional effort, and then often because of that, students might be reluctant to do that, and staff as well, I think. But just on one of the things I would suggest is, we took an online induction. In terms of the way in which we do evaluations in universities, we do all these questionnaires, constantly doing questionnaires. The problem with questionnaires, it only registers the views of those who do the questionnaire. And in a sense, we need to know about those people who are absent, who are not expressing an opinion, or might not actually have come online. And now, you know, we've got to use non-invasive and non-coercive ways of doing that. But, you know, I think Ian mentioned earlier on at Coventry University, you know, they've got this kind of like a call centre. So that is following people who are engaged, but in ways that doesn't punish them, but actually engages with them, as any, say, responsible parent might do. So any other responsible friend might do, is to say, you know, you missed out on that induction. What can we do to, you know, address that? So so I think that's really important, and that's, I think, linked to what Alison was saying about personalised way of working, because people's circumstances are different. You know, I think we need to acknowledge that.
Brilliant. Thank you all. So I'm afraid it's gone by like the wind, but we've come out to the end of our event. We've run out of time, and I'd like to thank all of those who submitted really excellent questions. We've had I just can't even count how many we've had, the 50 or 60 or so, as well as the ones that were submitted before the event. So I'm really genuinely very sorry if we haven't had a chance to answer your question, but we are going to try and get those written up for you and put onto the website after the event. So I'd like to extend our thanks to Gautam, Sarah and Allison for their time and contributions this afternoon. I found their insights, their advice, their passion and their everything they've been able to share with us about their experience, just so helpful. If we were in a room right now all together in a conference hall, there'd be a huge round of applause. So we'll just have to pretend, and I'll do that from my home in Gloucestershire. But thank you so much. Thank you to all our panellists for their contributions this afternoon, to Gary Loke, to Sarah Howells, Ian Dunn, Gautam Singh, Sarah Alkawad and Alison Shaw. Thank you to all our participants. We had 500 or so register. I think we've had at times over 300 in the event with us. We know that just the support that we can give our students during the pandemic is crucial, and our sector has an absolutely critical role to play in this in the short, medium and long term. So there will be some follow-up information and resources circulated. We're trying to pull together all of the resources that have been mentioned in the various reports and things that have been mentioned in the event, and we'll get those collated onto our website. This is the first online event that the OFS has organised during the pandemic, and we would very much like to continue doing this. We think this is a really excellent way of engaging with people in the sector, and we'd really welcome your feedback on how this could be improved. We'd also welcome your case studies, and we've put up a link now on the screen now to an email address that you can send these to. So supporting BAME students at officeforstudents.org.uk. So please follow on any comments, questions, case studies, etc. And just to add my thanks to the panel, but also to the team behind the scenes who have worked so hard in putting this together. So I'd like to just personally name check Claire, Nazra, Catherine, Josh, Kerry and Abigail, because they've done a fantastic job. And I want to wish you all a very happy weekend, and we hope to see you all at another OFS event in the future. So that's goodbye.